Hello and welcome into another episode of the Fantasy Football Forecast. I'm your host, Trevor Scott, coming at you with a solo episode going over 2024 draft lessons to prepare us for the 2025 drafts. Made a list of reviewing what went wrong for 2024, basically, and things that I feel like I learned going into this next year that I'm going to be applying here. I'm going to go through point by point. Hopefully, you guys find this informative and can help use this in your drafts in 2025, help start using it to help craft your draft strategy. The first point is to never doubt a Kevin O'Connell quarterback, right? We went into the year, I personally was pushing Justin Jefferson down in the wide receiver rankings. I didn't even have Sam Darnold in my top 20 quarterbacks. I know I was higher on him than most. We did have a breakout video and a sleeper video that we did include Darnold on for the exact same reason, but it wasn't like we were pushing him up. And JJ McCarthy now I do have inside my top 20 quarterbacks, even though we've never seen him play. And I think this is a big lesson to have been learned by everybody, right? I mean, everybody I feel like is pushing McCarthy up. I've seen him as high as 12 in some quarterback rankings. And so I think this is a big one that moving forward, wherever Kevin O'Connell is, the quarterback is going to be ranked well, and all of the weapons are going to be just fine in the offense. The next one, I think, is to wait at tight end. So I know it felt like last year that there were a couple up at the top. We even made a video breaking down tier one, those top four guys, and two of them kind of ended up being not that good. And we ended up seeing a bunch of quarterbacks later in the draft. A bunch of tight ends later in the draft performed so well. There was Bowers, there was TJ Hawkinson, who kind of came back, but then was good. There was David Njoku, who was good for a while. Tucker Kraft kind of came out of nowhere. And so if you had left that spot open, you could have picked him up off the waiver wire and he could have been your starter. And then there was also Jonnu Smith, who was like the top 3 tight end over the second half of the season. And if you picked him up, you were probably starting him pretty much over anybody but Bowers or McBride. So last year proved once again that tight end is just so deep. The position overall is just not that good, and there's always going to be players that emerge. So I just cannot stress enough. Wait at tight end. You think you need one. You think you need to go in on tight end 5 because it's the last guy you think you need. I just don't agree. There's always going to be somebody coming through, and watch somebody like Brenton Strange end up getting, 6-7 targets a game because he's the number 3 in their passing offense. And you're just going to wish that you had waited either to the end of the draft to take him or to just kind of leave the spot open for anything that happens early season or even in the middle of the season, or, if it comes down to it, try and strike in some sort of trade. But waiting on tight end, I think, is just the way to go in order to build out the best roster you can. The next thing that I think I learned from last year, which I did well last year, but I think I kind of more backed into it in Superflex, is to really try and get a hero quarterback strategy going. Pick one early and then try to fill out as much of your team as you can without just kind of like completely forgetting the quarterback 2 position, right? Keep an eye on it. Make sure you see as it fleets, but don't go in on like quarterback 10 or 12, right? And I think that people, maybe they want to lock in that spot. They're like, I went in early on quarterback. I want to make sure I get a good quarterback as my second guy too, lock in the positional group. And I think that's a mistake. I think you can get away with, especially if you have an elite one up top, right? So if you go in on a Lamar, you go in on an Allen, you go in on a Burrow, you go in on a Daniels, somebody like that hurts that type of quarterback in the first or second round of your Superflex league. Be satisfied to wait. Somebody that was drafted really late was Baker Mayfield, right? Sam Darnold was down there. That ended up being a very productive quarterback. Even Jared Goff was getting pushed down a little bit, and he was productive. So there's going to be value late. And if you wall yourself off in the 3rd or 4th round from being able to kind of try to hit on somebody late, I don't think that's a good idea, right? And you got so many guys down there this year, especially in 10-team leagues where Tua is going outside the top 20. Cam Ward is going outside the top 20. Michael Penix is going outside the top 20. JJ McCarthy is right on the edge of top 20. And even if you go in, right at the end, right, you can get even somebody with a little bit more upside than that that's going in that 17 to 20 range in, say, the 7th round. So in Superflex, especially if you go in early, I understand if you're picking a 5th round quarterback, if you don't have one yet, right, and you're starting to feel the urgency a little bit, you don't want to go completely zero QB. That's not a very good strategy. But if you lock in one of the studs and you're able to get that done in your draft, I think it's almost critical to wait until you really need another one, right? And that can vary from league to league based on how many roster spots you have to fill. If you only have 2 wide receivers in a super flex and you don't have that third wide receiver spot and you don't have an actual flex spot, maybe you can go in a little bit quicker on that second quarterback, right? You don't want to get left behind entirely if the board is starting to fly off in the 4th round and you're looking at QB 17 or 18 already in round 4, right? That's not necessarily good to just keep waiting until round 7. But if that's also why we stress building out your rosters a little bit more, make the starting player pool a little bit bigger so that there are values that present themselves later in the draft. And there's just more prep that can go into your drafts. So again, hero quarterback, I think, is absolutely the way to draft the position if you're fortunate enough to get one of those top 5. Another thing I think is good to do in a 3 wide receiver format specifically, obviously, this doesn't necessarily apply as much in 2 wide receiver leagues, but I think it's good in Superflex 3 wide receiver leagues to wait on running back. I know some people like to go in early and some people like to lock in 2 of the top 10 or 12. And I know running back was super good last year. So it's kind of hard to draw away from that strategy this year. But what I'll say is the value that presents itself in the 6th and 7th round at running back just feels like, again, this year it's going to be top end type of talent, right? I mean, you get Alvin Kamara going down there. You still have Ken Walker going down there. Anybody outside the top 15, really, you got Chuba Hubbard that's still down there, David Montgomery, James Conner, all types of valuable running backs, all sorts of guys that I feel like all have the upside to finish in the top 12, still going around 6 and 7. And the ability to get wide receivers that I feel like can really pop off and be in the top echelon, I just don't feel like is there. So that's why I feel like getting as many of those guys in the top 11 or 15, depending on how you feel about the next tier down after that Ladd, Drake London, and AJ Brown tier, just continue to try and stockpile those guys early. And, say you go quarterback, and if you get like a Bowers, maybe, right? We just talked about waiting on tight end, but then wide receiver, you're kind of in your 6th round or 5th round. That's when you should start looking towards running back. And I think doing that also builds in a level of safety to your team, because although injury can strike any position, I think running backs are the most vulnerable. And if you go in early, it just adds another level of risk to your team that in 3 wide receiver leagues, you don't need to do, because you can still get plenty of upside at the position. And I still do think stockpiling wide receivers just is a great way to make sure that your team is going to be consistent week over week. With that being said, I do want to add that it's okay to be aggressive on that first running back. Last year, right, there was a couple guys at the top where it did feel like they were going to be difference makers, and it kind of worked out, right? I know I was a little higher than consensus on Saquon Barkley last year, but I did have him as the third running back overall. Gibbs was up there. Christian McCaffrey obviously busted, so that's a little bit tough, but we all know the situation with McCaffrey, if you're going to take him, what you're getting yourself into. And then Bijan Robinson obviously was up there already. So in that upper echelon, those guys do almost feel like league winners, like major difference makers at the position. So this year, I think it's specifically the top 3 in Bijan, Gibbs, and Saquon. If you want to be aggressive and go get one of those guys in your 3 wide receiver leagues, I think that's still probably worth it. I have them all ranked behind Puka Nacua and Amon-Ra St. Brown, so I still would go in the top 5 receivers before I would consider a running back. But if you're in a super flex 3 wide receiver league that some of the league feels the same and a couple more wide receivers go off, and you're in the 2nd round looking at one of these guys, I think there is a chance that they could be league winners. So you should be heavily considering them there at that point. And if you do that, definitely wait a long time to take your second one. Your second running back can kind of get filled in almost by the waiver wire at that point. But that will definitely be the last spot in my starting lineup that I'm looking to fill. This next one is something that just is always the case. We just always have to hammer this home, because I feel like even sometimes I get caught in this trap of drafting players coming off of major knee injuries, right? It's a fool's errand to try and do it, right? Like look at what happened with Nick Chubb, right? We thought, 8 weeks and he'll be back to Nick Chubb. And then he was terrible when he came back. but predictably so. I mean, it wasn't like we should be drafting him in round 10, expecting that we can throw him on our IR spot and that he's going to be great in the second half. Don't do that. Just avoid making those draft mistakes on those players. They hardly ever work out. Another example last year with Jonathan Brooks. He was a rookie coming in. It was like he should be ready. And then it was like, oh, he's going to start on PUP, but he'll be ready week 5. And then it was like, oh, he's still not ready. And then he comes back and he just clearly wasn't right. And it's just easy to avoid those situations. If you don't end up going in on those players, don't draft players that you know are coming off of major knee injuries. Like Javonte Williams was a good example the year before. We all had high expectations of him coming back, and then he was still not even right last year, even though he got a full off season. So just do your best to avoid that, especially at the running back position, right? All those guys are running backs, but it still applies to the receiver position too quite a bit. It usually takes an additional year to kind of get back. And a guy that comes to mind that I've kind of been hyping a little bit is Brandon Ayuk, right? He's coming off that major knee injury, ACL. Rashee Rice is another one who's coming off a major knee injury. I will say his was not an ACL, so I feel a little better about him than I do Ayuk coming back. But just do yourself a favor. Don't draft those guys. Just avoid those situations entirely. Those guys are better left for the very end of the draft, in my opinion. And, if they end up working out later in the season, then great, right? You can use them as back-end starters, but the chances that they become anything great are just so low. So you're just eliminating another chance, another dart that you get to throw at the board. This next one is a little bit to a lesser extent because it's extremely hard to predict. But if any player you start hearing trade rumors early in the season, I would do my best to downgrade them in my rankings, right? So guys, for example, that got hit with this last year, right? Amari Cooper was one where he was like on the Browns. We were kind of hoping he was going to get traded, right? And then he ends up getting traded and it just was not to a better situation. Devontae Adams, another one where he kind of had an injury there for a while. And I know with the Jets, he ended up finishing great to the season, but you had to endure 4 weeks or 5 weeks where he wasn't even playing at all. And, if you're relying on him or if you ended up picking him in the 4th or 5th round, it's like in single QB leagues, sometimes in the 2nd round, it's like, man, this is really crushing my team not having him out there. So another one was Deontay Johnson, right? A guy on a bad team and expiring contract. It was kind of obvious to everybody other than me at the time, I guess, because I really liked Deontay. I wish he would have stayed with the Panthers, but that he was going to get traded, right? And so he went from being like a top flight fantasy option to like completely worthless, couldn't even get on the field. So I would do my best to just try to know who those players are going to be, try to evaluate it, see if there's any way that you can just downgrade them slightly. Even if it's a round or two, the chances that you end up getting them if you downgrade them an entire round is probably not very good. And if you do, and it's more in line with consensus, then you get a better deal on those players and you feel maybe a little bit better about having them on your roster if you get them at a discount. Another thing that I think is good to know going into your drafts, and another big lesson I feel like, is knowing the players' draft capitals when listening to camp hype. Obviously, there's a lot of noise that happens leading up training camp. Guys look good. They make big plays. All of a sudden, they're getting sort of buzz. The coaches, the beat writers, everybody's getting excited about players. I personally think where they get drafted or the role that they're getting drafted into matters a lot, right? So, for example, Jameson Williams was getting a ton of hype going into last year, and I was kind of brushing it off because he's done nothing, right? He never had more than one catch in a game going into last year, but the coaching staff was all over him. The beat writers were all over him, and he was a former early 1st-round pick. And, he had dealt with the suspension and he dealt with the ACL coming in. So there were kind of good explanations for why he never really got going. And then you just see him come out and get 20 targets in his first 2 weeks. Obviously, that level of volume didn't sustain, but it was clear he was going to have a breakout almost immediately upon starting the season. So definitely follow the draft capital when you're starting to hear hype about guys, and if it's somebody that gets drafted into a specific role behind a player that we think is a stud, right? Like last year there was Rachaad White, but he was kind of inefficient on the ground. They draft Bucky Irving, who is, a speedster. And there was a lot of question marks there. I was like, wait, but Rachaad White finishes a top 5 fantasy running back. But like, he didn't have a ton of draft capital behind him. And he was like 3.5 yards a carry. So it was like, there is room here for another running back. Like there had been discussions during the season before about him possibly getting less work, that type of thing. Never came to fruition. Obviously, ended up scoring like 20 touchdowns in 2023. But in 2024, Bucky came in. They clearly had an idea for the role they wanted him to be in. So paying attention to that. And I think, maybe we can get a little bit of that from Bashal Tutin and Travis Etienne, right? 2 years ago, he had an awesome season. Last year, it was kind of him and Bigsby, and he took a major step back. They draft somebody to fill a specific role. Specifically, I think they're going to have him challenge Etienne in the passing game, and he could possibly get into a little bit more advantageous roles on the ground, maybe some stretch runs, right? Not necessarily, hitting in between the tackles. So, I think there's some opportunity to, later in your drafts, especially, kind of try and figure out where you think these guys that are getting drafted highly or getting drafted for specific roles can fit. And I think doing that, a little bit of research on that in these later guys is good. And if you get the guys that don't have clear roles or that don't have any sort of draft capital, I think it's generally a better idea to kind of leave them for the more talented NFL players. This next point I think is a big one. I probably should have mentioned this earlier, but I'm a huge fan of drafting guys that are going to have a week 1 role. There were 2 major examples of this last year, and it was Chuba Hubbard and Jerome Ford, right? Nick Chubb was out and Jonathan Brooks was out. And if you drafted both of those guys, they were both free. They were both like 11th and 12th round picks outside the top 40 at running back. And if you were secured those guys, right, obviously Ford wasn't nearly as good and ended up kind of being, kind of drop worthy, but you could kind of still hang with him on the end of your bench. But you would have got Chuba, who ended up being a top 10 running back. Brooks never really made it back, and Chuba just was great all year long. And so drafting guys that potentially have a hurt starter behind them, but the guy that's going to be the week 1 starter, that even if it doesn't work out for them to be long-term, they get you off to a hot start, somebody that you can plug into your lineup early in the year. And maybe if the other guy does get caught up eventually and his value does actually diminish, you can maybe try and, make a trade either for the other player that's getting healthy, or you can try and move the player that you own to them at that point, right? And yeah, that's a little bit hard to like draft a guy for a trade, but when you're that late in the draft, I think it's worth just taking a guy and hoping that he works out, and that he can maintain a role all year long. The big one that this applied to going into this year was Juwan Jennings. Now, obviously, he just asked for a new contract, so it's just like, dude, so the 49ers are just down so bad at wide receiver if Jennings isn't going to report to training camp. But he, to me, felt like the guy at the end of the draft. And I guess you can apply it to Pearsall too, but it really felt like Jennings had a really good year last year, had a couple breakout games. And if he got some sort of consistent role before Brandon Ayuk got back on the field, and if Ayuk gets back on the field, right, or if Ayuk gets his role back once he's back on the field, it could just still be Jennings. That's the player that I felt fit the mold most clearly going into this year. Another one that I specifically learned, because I was not a huge fan of this, but holdouts for superstars are kind of overrated. For CeeDee Lamb, I mean, do we even remember he held out last year? And then for Jamar Chase, obviously we remember a little bit more that he held out, but he ended up being the number 1 wide receiver last year. Those guys, obviously CeeDee Lamb dealt with shoulder injury and with Dak getting hurt, right? So that was kind of outside of the holdout. And Chase took a little bit to get going, obviously, like anybody would, but he ended up just completely breaking fantasy over the second half of the year. So I would urge on superstar players specifically, don't sweat the holdouts. I mean, I was so worried about Jamar Chase. I was getting so paranoid about him even playing or getting back. I guess scarred a little bit by Le'Veon Bell still, even all these years later. But I don't think it applies to players that aren't superstars. We saw Brandon Ayuk also hold out. He is not a superstar. He never got going. He didn't score a touchdown. He had one game over 100 yards, and I think he got up to like 148 in that game. So he did have a really good yardage game. But if you're not a superstar and you're holding out, you need that time in camp to get yourself ready and to just be integrated into the offense. Every single season there's something new to be learned. So, if it's not a superstar player, I don't necessarily think that that's something that we should be, going, or that's something where then I'll drop the player, but a superstar, I will not. And I'm kind of hopeful that we're not going to have any big name superstars like holding out. Maybe James Cook. But again, he falls more towards the IU class than towards the Chase and CD class. But at wide receiver, I don't think we're going to be facing anything major. I mean, Juwan Jennings, but he's already being drafted outside the top 100. That doesn't really count. So, I think you guys get the idea on this one. Anybody that's kind of, a top 5 to 10 player at their position, it's okay if they're holding out. They're going to be just fine. And the last point I want to make in this video is about rookie pass catchers. So I have always hesitated at trusting rookie pass catchers. And this last year, we got told over and over, this is like the best wide receiver class we've seen in a long time. And it did include Bowers in that too, right? And I just have been so reluctant to get on board with rookie tight ends. And I've been so reluctant to get on board with rookie wide receivers. It's just like, I want to see it first. I want to know what it looks like. But then you miss the values, right? And I mean, we saw it with Jamar Chase. He was like a 5th round pick the year he was a rookie, and he was a superstar. And then we see it again with Malik Neighbors. I have him ranked down at wide receiver 30 because I was worried Daniel Jones had never supported a top 36 wide receiver. And it was like, oh, well, he's literally going to set a record for rookie receptions because he's always open. For rookie targets because he's always open. And so, I mean, at a certain point, I'm going to have to just stop discounting these guys because they're rookies, right? And then you got Brock Bowers, who was unbelievable as a rookie at tight end. You got Sam Laporta, who was tight end 1 the year before. You have Trey McBride, who over the second half of the year was averaging over 15 points a game. And then we kind of bought in on Dalton Kincaid last year, but he was kind of a flop. So that's not necessarily the greatest example, but even him, that we were pushing him up into the top of the tight end rankings. So, there's just, you start looking at some of these positions, and it's like even Brian Thomas Jr. and Ladd McConkey, got it going last year. And it's like, I gotta be more in on some of these pass catchers. I think and this year didn't have the greatest class, but I look at the rankings and I'm like, man, are we really going to draft our first rookie wide receiver outside the top 25 receivers? It's like, if the last couple of years are any indication, like Travis Hunter, Tedero McMillan specifically should be going earlier than they are. And the fact that they're not presents a excellent buying opportunity here. And I think the same is true of Colston Loveland and Tyler Warren. It's just like, these guys are top 14 picks in the NFL draft. Colston 10th and Warren 14th. And it's like, they're not just picking those guys to not use them, right? They're not picking those guys for next year, right? Those guys are going to be used heavily as rookies. And I just think all of these guys are more pro ready than we've ever seen before. And so I really think that it's that they're, like I've been saying, right, that these guys are all being kind of drafted this season at a discount. I would very much be looking to draft these guys at their ADPs, because I just think we've seen so much track record now over the last 2 or 3 years of rookies having success. And the more that you can get discounts during the draft, the better your team will be. All right. Thank you guys so much for listening to this. I hope this helps. I hope that this video has a little bit of staying power as we get into draft season 2, because we're going to release this about a month before draft season really starts to hit. But if you enjoyed this video, if you're still here, hit the like button, hit that subscribe button. We look forward to talking to you in the next one. Thanks.